Sarah Martinez had been coming to the Pine Valley shooting range for 3 months, and in all that time, nobody had heard her speak a single word. She arrived every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 4:30 p.m., carrying a worn leather case that contained her grandfather's vintage rifle. The other regulars at the range had grown accustomed to her presence, though they found her silence both mysterious and somewhat unsettling. The shooting range was a place where stories were shared, where veterans swapped tales of their service, and where beginners asked endless questions about technique and equipment. But Sarah existed in her own quiet bubble, methodically setting up at Lane 7, the same spot every time, and firing round after precise round into targets that she placed at increasingly difficult distances. Tommy Chen, the range master, had tried numerous times to engage her in conversation. He'd comment on her excellent groupings, ask about her rifle, or simply offer a friendly greeting. Sarah would respond with polite nods, brief smiles, or simple gestures, but never words. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They held a depth that suggested experiences far beyond what most people at the recreational range could imagine. The other regulars had developed their own theories about the silent woman. Bill Harrison, a retired police officer, was convinced she was former military, citing her perfect posture and the professional way she handled her weapon. Maria Santos, who worked as a nurse and came to the range to relieve stress, thought perhaps Sarah had experienced some trauma that had stolen her voice. The younger crowd, led by Jake Miller, a college student who fancied himself quite the marksman, simply found her strange and somewhat intimidating. Sarah's routine never varied. She would arrive, nod politely to whoever was working the front desk, sign in with careful handwriting, and make her way to Lane 7. She'd set up her equipment with military precision, each item placed in exactly the same position relative to the others. Her shooting sessions lasted exactly 90 minutes, during which she would fire approximately 200 rounds, clean her weapon thoroughly, pack everything away, and leave as quietly as she had arrived. What the others didn't know was that Sarah's silence wasn't by choice. 3 years earlier, she had been Sergeant Sarah Martinez, a communications specialist with the 75th Ranger Regiment. During her second deployment in Afghanistan, an improvised explosive device had detonated near her convoy. The blast had left her physically unharmed, but had stolen something precious from her. The psychological trauma, combined with a mild traumatic brain injury, had affected her ability to speak. The words were there, trapped somewhere between her thoughts and her voice, but they simply wouldn't come. The shooting range had become Sarah's therapy, though she'd never told the therapists at the VA hospital about her visits. The familiar weight of a rifle in her hands, the controlled breathing, the steady heartbeat as she aligned her sights. These things brought her a peace that no amount of counseling had been able to provide. In those moments, with her eye pressed to the scope and her finger gently caressing the trigger, she felt like herself again. She felt like the soldier she used to be. On this particular Friday evening, the range was busier than usual. A group of corporate executives had booked lanes for a team-building exercise, their nervous laughter and poor weapon handling creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that made Sarah slightly uncomfortable. She tried to focus on her own shooting, but the constant chatter and occasional safety violations from the inexperienced shooters kept breaking her concentration. At the far end of the range, in Lane 12, stood a man Sarah had never seen before. Unlike the corporate group, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His stance was perfect, his breathing controlled, and when he fired, each shot found its mark with deadly precision. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, something that made Sarah's trained eye take notice. The man was tall and lean, with graying hair cropped short, in a style that suggested military background. His clothes were civilian, but they couldn't hide the bearing of someone who had spent years in uniform. As Sarah watched him between her own shots, she noticed the small details that confirmed her suspicions: the way he cleared his weapon, the methodical approach to reloading, and most tellingly, the small tattoo visible on his forearm when he rolled up his sleeves. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that tattoo. It was the distinctive skull and crossed arrows of the 75th Ranger Regiment, identical to the one she carried on her own shoulder. This man was a ranger, and judging by his age and the confident way he handled himself, likely a senior one. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that she hadn't experienced since leaving the service. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself stealing glances at the mysterious ranger. He seemed equally focused on his own shooting, but she caught him looking in her direction more than once. There was something in his gaze that suggested recognition, though Sarah was certain they had never met. The corporate group eventually finished their session and left, their departure bringing a welcome quiet to the range. In the sudden silence, broken only by the occasional shot from one of the remaining shooters, Sarah heard something that made her heart skip a beat. The man in lane 12 had whispered something so quietly that she almost missed it. But the words, carried on the still air of the indoor range, reached her ears with crystal clarity. "Outstanding grouping, Sergeant." Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as she lowered her rifle. Nobody at the range knew her rank. Nobody knew about her military service. She had been careful to keep that part of her life private, finding it too painful to discuss. Yet somehow this stranger had identified her not just as former military, but had guessed her exact rank. The familiar term of address, spoken with, the respect and recognition that only came from one service member to another, stirred something deep within her that had been dormant for far too long. Sarah's rifle remained steady in her hands, but her heart was racing. She turned slightly to get a better look at the man who had spoken, trying to process what had just happened. The stranger continued his shooting routine as if nothing had occurred, but Sarah could sense a subtle tension in his posture that suggested he was very much aware of her attention. Tommy Chen, who had been helping another customer, approached Sarah's lane to collect some empty brass casings. He noticed her stillness and the way she was staring down the range. "Everything okay, Sarah?" he asked, using the name from her registration form. She nodded absently, but her eyes remained fixed on lane 12. The man finished his shooting session with the same methodical precision he had displayed throughout the evening. As he began to pack his equipment, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She set down her rifle, engaged the safety, and walked toward lane 12. Her legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotions that the stranger's words had triggered. As she approached, the man looked up from cleaning his pistol. Up close, Sarah could see that her initial assessment had been correct. This was definitely a career military man, probably in his 50s, with the weathered face and steady eyes of someone who had seen combat. His movements were economical and precise, and when he looked at her directly, she felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated by a superior officer. "Master Sergeant David Walsh, retired," he said quietly, extending a calloused hand. "I couldn't help but notice your technique. It's been a while since I've seen someone handle a rifle with that kind of precision outside of a military context." Sarah stared at his outstretched hand, her mind racing. She wanted to respond, to introduce herself, to ask how he had known her rank, but the words remained trapped, just as they had been for the past 3 years. She shook his hand briefly, noting the firm grip and the way his eyes searched her face with the kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. Walsh seemed to recognize her struggle. He didn't push for a verbal response, instead, continuing to speak in the calm, measured tones of someone accustomed to dealing with soldiers who were fighting their own battles. "I served with the Rangers for 22 years, he said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the full tattoo that Sarah had glimpsed earlier. "Saw action in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a few places that don't officially exist on any map." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the details of his tattoo. Below the Ranger insignia were small marks that she recognized as deployment indicators. This man had been through multiple combat tours, and judging by the way he carried himself, he had been in leadership positions. She found herself nodding, a gesture that seemed to encourage him to continue. "I've been coming to this range for about 6 months, Walsh continued, carefully placing his cleaned weapon in its case. "Noticed you here several times. Your form, your breathing, the way you clear malfunctions, it's textbook Ranger training. But more than that, there's something in your eyes that I recognize. Something that tells me you've been where I've been." Sarah felt tears beginning to form, though she fought to keep them from falling. This stranger was seeing her in a way that no one had since she'd returned from deployment, not as the broken, silent woman that everyone else saw, but as the soldier she had been. The recognition was both painful and healing at the same time. Walsh seemed to sense her emotional turmoil. He finished packing his equipment, but made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter that separated the lanes, his posture relaxed but attentive. "You know," he said conversationally, "I had a soldier in my unit once. Good kid, sharp as a tack, could outshoot most of the men in the platoon. Communications specialist, if I remember correctly." Sarah's breath caught. The coincidence seemed too specific to be accidental. "She was in a convoy that got hit by an IED, Walsh continued, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Physically, she was fine, but something inside got damaged. Couldn't talk for months afterward. The doc said it was psychological trauma combined with a mild TBI. Common enough in our line of work, unfortunately." Sarah stared at him, her hands beginning to shake slightly. How could he know so much about her specific situation? Unless he had been there, unless he had been part of her chain of command, and she simply didn't remember him from those chaotic days following the explosion. Walsh noticed her reaction and nodded slowly. "I wasn't your direct supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, but I was the senior NCO who signed your medical evacuation papers. I also wrote a letter recommending you for the Purple Heart, though I know you never received it due to the nature of your injuries not being considered visible wounds at the time." The tears that Sarah had been fighting finally broke through. She covered her face with her hands as 3 years of suppressed emotion came flooding out. The frustration of being unable to communicate, the isolation of being trapped in silence, the guilt over surviving when others hadn't. It all came, pouring out in silent sobs that shook her entire body. Walsh moved closer but respectfully maintained some distance. "It's okay, soldier," he said softly, using the term with the affection and respect that only one service member could show another. "You've been carrying this alone for too long, but you don't have to anymore." When Sarah finally looked up, Walsh was holding out a clean handkerchief. His eyes held no pity, only understanding and genuine concern. "I've seen this before," he said. "The silence isn't permanent unless you let it be. Sometimes all it takes is remembering who you used to be and finding someone who believes in who you can become again." Sarah took the handkerchief and wiped, her eyes feeling simultaneously vulnerable and stronger than she had in years. For the first time since the explosion, someone saw her as more than a victim. Someone recognized the soldier that still existed beneath the trauma and silence. "I know this is a lot to process," Walsh said gently, "but I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight. If you're willing, I'd like to help you find your voice again. Not just the ability to speak, but the confidence and strength that made you the soldier you were." Sarah spent the weekend thinking about her encounter with Master Sergeant Walsh. His words had stirred something deep within her, a spark of hope that she had thought was permanently extinguished. She found herself looking forward to Tuesday's shooting session with an anticipation that felt foreign after months of going through the motions of her routine. When Tuesday arrived, Sarah arrived at the range 15 minutes earlier than usual. She was disappointed to find that Walsh wasn't there, but she set up in her regular spot and began her shooting routine. About halfway through her session, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. "Good evening, Sergeant," came Walsh's familiar voice. Sarah turned to find him carrying a different case than he had used on Friday, this one larger and more weathered. "Mind if I set up next to you today? Lane 8 is available." Sarah nodded, surprising herself with how genuinely pleased she was to see him. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since leaving the military. As Walsh set up his equipment, Sarah noticed that this case contained not a pistol, but a rifle very similar to her own. "This belonged to my father," Walsh explained, noticing her interest. "He carried it in Vietnam, and I've kept it in working condition ever since he passed. Sometimes I bring it out when I want to remember where I came from and what I'm fighting for." As they shot side by side, Walsh began to share stories from his military career. He spoke about difficult missions, the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, and the challenge of returning to civilian life. His stories weren't dramatic war tales meant to impress, but rather honest reflections on the experiences that had shaped him as both a soldier and a person. Sarah found herself hanging on every word. She hadn't realized how much she missed hearing someone speak her language, the language of military service with its unique understanding of duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Walsh's stories triggered her own memories, both good and painful, but for the first time in years, the painful ones didn't overwhelm her. After about an hour of shooting, Walsh suggested they take a break. He produced a thermos of coffee and 2 cups from his bag. "One thing I learned in the service," he said, pouring the steaming liquid, "is that some of the most important conversations happen over a simple cup of coffee." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. Walsh settled back against the counter and looked at her with the patient expression of someone who had all the time in the world. "I've been thinking about what I said on Friday," he began, "about helping you find your voice. I want you to know that I don't expect miracles, and I'm not trying to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I do believe that the soldier I see when you're behind that rifle is still very much alive inside you." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that always accompanied her attempts to speak. She opened her mouth, willing the words to come, but only managed a small, frustrated sound. Walsh noticed her struggle and leaned forward slightly. "Don't force it," he said gently. "Sometimes the voice comes back gradually, starting with sounds that aren't quite words. Other times it comes back all at once when the right trigger presents itself. Every person's journey is different." Sarah nodded, feeling both grateful for his understanding and frustrated with her own limitations. She pulled out her phone and typed a message, showing it to Walsh. "Thank you for seeing me as more than broken." Walsh read the message and smiled. "You were never broken, Sergeant. Wounded, maybe. Dealing with invisible injuries that are just as real as any physical wound, but not broken. Broken things can't be fixed, but wounded warriors can heal." Over the next hour, they developed a comfortable rhythm of communication. Sarah would type messages on her phone or use simple gestures, while Walsh responded with the patience and understanding of someone who had worked with traumatized soldiers before. Sarah learned that Walsh had spent his last 5 years of service working with soldiers recovering from combat trauma, and that her case was not unique. "I've seen probably a dozen soldiers with similar symptoms," Walsh explained. "The combination of psychological trauma and mild TBI can affect speech in various ways. Some soldiers recover their voices quickly with the right support, others take longer. But the ones who don't give up, who keep fighting, they usually find their way back." Sarah typed another message. "How do you know I haven't given up?" Walsh gestured toward the targets she had been shooting all evening. "Because you keep coming here. Because you maintain your skills and your discipline. Because when I spoke to you on Friday, I saw a flicker of the warrior you used to be. That flicker tells me the fight isn't over." As their session wound down, Walsh made a suggestion that caught Sarah off guard. "There's a veterans support group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. It's not a formal therapy session, just a group of former military personnel who get together to talk, share experiences, and support each other. Most of them have been where you are now, in one way or another." Sarah's first instinct was to shake her head. The idea of sitting in a circle with strangers, unable to contribute to the conversation, seemed more like torture than therapy. But Walsh seemed to anticipate her reluctance. "You don't have to speak," he said. "Half the guys barely say a word for their first few meetings. But there's something powerful about being around people who understand what you've been through. People who don't need explanations or feel sorry for you. People who see the soldier first and the symptoms second." Sarah considered his words as they packed up their equipment. The shooting range had become her sanctuary precisely because it was predictable and solitary. The idea of venturing into a group setting felt terrifying, but also oddly appealing. She had been isolated for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community that understood her. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She reached out and gently touched Walsh's arm, then pointed to herself and held up 4 fingers, followed by pointing toward the door. The message was clear. "Thursday here, meet me." Walsh understood immediately and smiled. "I'll pick you up at 6:30. The group meets from 7 to 9, and afterward we usually grab dinner at a diner that's owned by a former Navy chief. Good food, good company, and nobody asks too many questions. Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. As she walked to her car, she realized that for the first time since her injury, she was looking forward to something beyond her solitary shooting sessions. The prospect of being around other veterans, people who might understand her silence without judgment, filled her with a cautious optimism. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about Walsh's words and the possibility of healing that he represented. She had spent 3 years convinced that her voice was gone forever, that the silent woman at the shooting range was all she would ever be. But Walsh's recognition of the soldier within her had awakened something that had been dormant for too long, the belief that she could fight her way back to the person she used to be. Thursday evening arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her civilian clothes for the 3rd time, and questioning her decision to attend the veteran support group. The comfortable isolation she had maintained for 3 years suddenly felt safer than the unknown territory she was about to enter. Walsh arrived precisely at 6:30, driving a well-maintained pickup truck that somehow perfectly matched his personality. As Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, he greeted her with a warm smile and didn't comment on the obvious nervousness written across her face. "The community center is about 15 minutes from here," Walsh said as they pulled away from Sarah's apartment complex. "I should probably give you a heads up about the group so you know what to expect." As they drove through the evening traffic, Walsh described the other members of their veterans support group. There was Miguel Santos, a former Marine who had lost his left leg to an IED but had become a competitive cyclist. Jennifer Park, an Air Force veteran who struggled with severe anxiety but had found peace through painting. Robert Bear Johnson, a former Navy SEAL who dealt with nightmares but had channeled his energy into woodworking. Each person had their own story, their own struggles, and their own path toward healing. "The thing about this group," Walsh explained, "is that nobody tries to fix anybody else. We just show up, share what we're comfortable sharing, and listen without judgment. Some nights are heavier than others, but there's always someone who understands exactly what you're going through." Sarah appreciated his matter-of-fact approach to describing the group. He wasn't overselling it or making promises about miraculous recoveries. He was simply presenting it as what it was, a gathering of people who had served their country and were now serving each other through their presence and understanding. The community center was a modest building tucked between a pharmacy and a small grocery store. Walsh led Sarah through a side entrance to a comfortable room with chairs arranged in a loose circle. About 8 people were already there, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, representing different branches of service and different eras of military history. Walsh made quiet introductions, mentioning only that Sarah was a fellow veteran who preferred to listen rather than speak. Nobody pressed for details or made her feel like an oddity. They simply welcomed her with nods and genuine smiles that conveyed acceptance without curiosity. The group facilitator was Dr. Patricia Williams, a former Army psychiatrist who had been conducting these sessions for over a decade. She had a calm, authoritative presence that reminded Sarah of the best officers she had served under, people who led by example and created environments where soldiers felt safe to be vulnerable. As the session began, Sarah was struck by the natural flow of conversation. People shared updates about their week, discussed challenges they were facing, and offered support to others who were struggling. There was no forced positivity or pressure to participate beyond one's comfort level. Miguel talked about his preparation for an upcoming cycling competition and how the physical training was helping him process some difficult memories from his deployment. Jennifer shared a painting she had been working on, describing how the colors helped her express emotions that she couldn't find words for. Bear mentioned that he had started teaching woodworking classes to other veterans and how rewarding it was to see their pride in creating something beautiful with their hands. Sarah listened intently, surprised by how much she connected with their stories. Their struggles were different from hers in the specifics, but the underlying themes were achingly familiar. The challenge of readjusting to civilian life, the isolation that came with experiences that others couldn't understand, and the ongoing work of healing from wounds that weren't visible to the outside world. About halfway through the session, Dr. Williams addressed the group with a question that made Sarah's heart race. "I'd like to talk tonight about finding our voices. Not necessarily speaking voices, but the ways we communicate our experiences and needs to the world around us. Sometimes our most powerful voice isn't verbal at all." The discussion that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Group members talked about the different ways they had learned to express themselves after returning from service. Some had found their voices through art, others through writing, and still others through actions rather than words. The conversation normalized nonverbal communication in a way that made Sarah feel less isolated in her silence. When Dr. Williams gently invited Sarah to share anything she felt comfortable with, Sarah found herself reaching for her phone. She typed a brief message and held it up for the group to see. 3 years silent, still trying to find my way back. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Bear nodded knowingly and said, "The journey back isn't linear, and it sure isn't quick. But you're here, and that says something important about who you are." Jennifer added, "I couldn't speak about my experiences for almost 2 years after I got out. Not because I couldn't physically talk, but because I couldn't find words that other people would understand." This group was the first place where I didn't have to explain everything from scratch. As the session continued, Sarah began to relax in a way she hadn't experienced since before her deployment. These people understood the weight of service, the cost of war, and the long road of recovery without needing detailed explanations. Their acceptance of her silence felt like the first real breath she had taken in 3 years. Near the end of the session, something unexpected happened. During a moment of quiet reflection, Sarah felt a strange sensation in her throat. It wasn't the familiar tightness that usually accompanied her attempts to speak, but rather a loosening, as if something that had been clenched tight was beginning to relax. Dr. Williams was wrapping up the session when Sarah suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to contribute something meaningful. She looked around the circle at these people who had welcomed her so completely, and for the first time in 3 years, words formed in her mind with clarity and purpose. Sarah opened her mouth, and to her own amazement, a sound emerged. It wasn't quite a word, more of a whispered "thank you," but it was audible and intentional. The group heard it, and while they didn't make a big fuss, the smiles that spread around the circle conveyed their understanding of the significance of that moment. Walsh, sitting beside her, gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "That's a hell of a start, Sergeant," he whispered, and Sarah could hear the pride in his voice. As the group began to disperse, several members approached Sarah with genuine warmth. They didn't ask questions about her condition or offer unsolicited advice. Instead, they shared their contact information and invited her to various activities: Miguel's cycling group, Jennifer's painting sessions, Bear's woodworking classes. They were offering her a community, a network of support that extended beyond the Thursday evening meetings. Walking back to Walsh's truck, Sarah felt different. The 2 whispered words had been small, but they represented something monumental, proof that her voice wasn't gone forever, just buried under layers of trauma and time. The path forward still seemed long and uncertain, but for the first time in 3 years, she believed that she could walk it successfully. Walsh seemed to sense her emotional state and didn't push for conversation during the drive home. Instead, he let the comfortable silence speak for itself, occasionally glancing over with an expression of quiet satisfaction. As he pulled up to her apartment, he turned to face her directly. "You did something brave tonight," he said simply. "Not just by coming, but by allowing yourself to hope again. That's often the hardest step." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life began to change in ways both subtle and profound. She continued attending the Thursday support group meetings, and with each session, she felt more connected to the community of veterans who had welcomed her so warmly. More importantly, she noticed that the tightness in her throat was beginning to ease, and occasionally single words would emerge during moments of strong emotion. Her shooting sessions with Walsh became a regular fixture in her week. They would meet on Tuesdays and Fridays, shooting side by side while Walsh continued to share stories from his military career and his experiences helping other veterans navigate their transitions to civilian life. Sarah had begun bringing a small notebook to these sessions, writing down thoughts and responses that she couldn't yet voice. One Tuesday evening, as they were cleaning their weapons after a particularly good shooting session, Walsh noticed that Sarah seemed more agitated than usual. She kept glancing toward the entrance of the range and checking her phone, behaviors that were uncharacteristic for someone who usually displayed such focused calm. "Everything okay, Sergeant?" Walsh asked, using the rank that had become a term of endearment between them. Sarah pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly, "Anniversary coming up. 3 years since the explosion. Always harder this time of year." Walsh nodded with understanding. He had worked with enough veterans to know that anniversary dates of traumatic events often triggered increased anxiety and emotional upheaval. "How do you usually handle it?" he asked gently. Sarah's response was brief but telling. "Alone. Very alone." Walsh was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "You know, isolation might have been your survival strategy for the past couple of years, but it doesn't have to be this year. You've got people now who understand what you're going through." Sarah looked at him skeptically, then wrote, "They have their own problems. Don't want to be a burden." "That's where you're wrong," Walsh replied firmly. "One of the most important things I learned in my 22 years of service is that we're stronger together than we are apart. The people in that support group, they're not looking for perfect people who have everything figured out. They're looking for real people who are fighting the same battles they are." Over the next few days, Sarah found herself thinking about Walsh's words. The anniversary date was approaching rapidly, and she could feel her anxiety building in familiar patterns. In previous years, she had simply endured those difficult days, weathering the emotional storm in isolation until it passed. But this year felt different, partly because she now had people in her life who might actually understand what she was experiencing. 3 days before the anniversary, Sarah received an unexpected text message from Jennifer, the Air Force veteran from the support group. It was a picture of a painting Jennifer had been working on, an abstract piece in blues and grays that somehow perfectly captured the feeling of grief and healing existing simultaneously. The message that accompanied the painting read, "Working through some tough memories this week. This is helping. Thought you might understand." Sarah stared at the image for a long time, struck by how accurately it represented her own emotional landscape. She typed back a simple response. "Beautiful. Thank you for sharing." Jennifer's reply came quickly. "Coffee tomorrow. I know a quiet place. Sometimes it helps to sit with someone who gets it even without talking." Sarah found herself accepting the invitation before she could talk herself out of it. The next day she met Jennifer at a small coffee shop tucked away from the main streets. Jennifer had chosen a corner table away from the crowd, and they sat together in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow comforted by the other's presence. After about 30 minutes, Jennifer spoke quietly. "I don't know what your anniversary is about, but I can see it in your eyes. That look that says something big is coming and you're trying to armor up for it." Sarah nodded, feeling tears beginning to form. "Mine's next month," Jennifer continued. "The day our convoy got hit by mortars. Lost 2 good people that day, and I still can't figure out why I was the one who walked away unscathed. Well, physically unscathed anyway." Sarah reached for her phone and typed, "IED 3 years ago. No physical injuries, but lost my voice. Lost who I was." Jennifer read the message and reached across to gently touch Sarah's hand. "But you're still here, still fighting. That counts for something." That evening, Sarah attended the Thursday support group meeting with a different perspective. Instead of sitting quietly and observing, she found herself really listening to how the other members talked about their difficult days and anniversaries. She realized that everyone in the room had dates that haunted them, memories that surfaced with painful clarity at predictable times. When Dr. Williams opened the floor for sharing, Sarah surprised herself by raising her hand slightly. The gesture was small, but it was noticed. Dr. Williams nodded encouragingly. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed the message she had prepared. "Anniversary of my injury is this weekend. First time I won't be facing it completely alone." "Doctor?" Williams smiled warmly. "How does that feel knowing you have support this time?" Sarah thought for a moment, then typed, "Scary, but also hopeful. Bear leaned forward in his chair. I'll tell you what helped me with my anniversaries. I started doing something positive on those days, something that honored the person I was before and the person I'm becoming after. Turned the day from being just about loss into being about growth too. Miguel nodded in agreement. I do a long bike ride on my anniversary, not to run away from the memories, but to prove to myself that I'm still capable of moving forward, literally and figuratively. Sarah found these suggestions intriguing. She had always approached her anniversary with dread, counting down the days until it passed. The idea of actively engaging with the date in a positive way had never occurred to her. As the meeting wound down, Walsh approached her with an idea. I've been thinking about what Bear said. What if we did something special at the range this weekend? Something that celebrates the soldier you were and acknowledges the strength you've shown in fighting your way back? Sarah looked at him questioningly. I'm thinking about a precision shooting challenge, Walsh explained. Nothing competitive or stressful, just a chance for you to demonstrate the skills that are still very much a part of who you are. We could invite the others from the group who are interested in shooting. Make it a community event rather than a solitary struggle. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Sarah had never shot in front of the support group members, and the thought of performing under observation brought back memories of military evaluations and the pressure to excel. But there was also something attractive about the idea of showing these people who had accepted her silence that she possessed skills and capabilities that transcended her current limitations. Sarah wrote in her notebook, What if I mess up? What if the pressure makes everything worse? Walsh read her concern and smiled. Then you'll mess up in front of people who care about you and understand that bad days happen. People who know that one bad shooting session doesn't erase years of training and natural ability. Sarah considered his words. The anniversary was going to be difficult regardless of how she chose to spend it. At least this way she would be surrounded by people who understood trauma and wouldn't judge her if she struggled. She nodded slowly, then wrote, Okay, but small group. And if I need to leave, I leave. Absolutely, Walsh agreed. Your comfort and safety come first, always. That Friday evening, Sarah found herself preparing for the anniversary in a completely different way than she had in previous years. Instead of dreading the approaching date, she was focused on preparing for the shooting challenge. She cleaned her grandfather's rifle with extra care, organized her ammunition, and even practiced some breathing exercises that Dr. Williams had taught the group for managing anxiety. As she went to bed that night, Sarah realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was approaching her anniversary date with something other than pure dread. There was still anxiety, still the familiar weight of difficult memories, but there was also anticipation and a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for far too long. The next morning, Sarah woke with the immediate awareness that this was the day. 3 years ago, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, her convoy had been traveling along a dusty road in Afghanistan when the world exploded around them. For 3 years, she had marked this moment with silence and solitude, letting the memories wash over her in painful waves. This year, as 10:30 approached, Sarah was at the shooting range with Walsh, Jennifer, Miguel, and Bear, setting up targets at various distances. The familiar weight of her rifle in her hands and the supportive presence of her fellow veterans created a buffer against the emotional impact of the anniversary moment. When 10:30 arrived, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest and the rush of memories that always accompanied this time. But instead of being alone with her pain, she was surrounded by people who understood trauma, who had their own difficult moments, and who were choosing to spend their Saturday morning helping her reclaim this date. Take your time, Sergeant, Walsh said quietly. When you're ready. Sarah positioned herself at the firing line, her rifle steady despite the emotional turbulence she was experiencing. As she looked through the scope at the target 100 yards away, she felt something shift inside her. The explosion 3 years ago had taken her voice, but it hadn't taken her skills, her training, or her fundamental identity as a soldier. She fired her first shot, and it hit dead center. The second shot grouped perfectly with the first. By the fifth shot, she had created a grouping that would have impressed her drill instructors back in basic training. As she continued shooting, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion, as if she was proving to herself and to the memories that haunted her that she was still the competent, capable soldier she had always been. After she finished her first string of shots, Miguel whistled appreciatively. "That's some serious marksmanship, Sarah. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar urge to retreat into silence. But surrounded by these people who had accepted her completely, she found herself reaching for her phone to type a longer response than usual. "Grandfather taught me as a kid. Army refined it. Some things the explosion couldn't take away." Jennifer smiled and nodded. "The important parts of who we are, they're stronger than whatever tried to break us." As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself shooting better than she had in months. But more importantly, she was enjoying herself in a way that felt almost foreign after 3 years of approaching shooting as a solitary, therapeutic exercise. The camaraderie, the gentle competition, and the shared understanding of what it meant to be a warrior in both war and peace created an atmosphere that felt like healing. Near the end of their session, as Sarah was cleaning her rifle, she felt words forming in her throat with a clarity and strength that surprised her. She looked around at the group of veterans who had chosen to spend their Saturday helping her reclaim her anniversary, and she felt an overwhelming gratitude that demanded expression. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "for seeing the soldier in me when I couldn't see her myself." The words hung in the air for a moment, the first full sentence she had spoken in 3 years. The group's response was perfect in its restraint. Smiles, nods, and Bear's simple reply. "That soldier was always there, Sarah. She was just waiting for the right moment to make herself known again." In the weeks following the anniversary shooting challenge, Sarah's progress accelerated in ways that surprised even Dr. Williams. The breakthrough of speaking her first complete sentence seemed to have unlocked something fundamental within her. Words began coming more frequently, though still quietly and carefully chosen. More importantly, Sarah began to believe in her own recovery in a way she never had before. The shooting range, which had been her solitary sanctuary for so long, transformed into a gathering place. Walsh continued to meet her for their regular sessions, but now they were often joined by other members of the support group. Jennifer discovered she had a natural aptitude for precision shooting, while Miguel found that the controlled breathing techniques transferred well to his cycling training. Bear, despite his large frame, proved to have surprisingly steady hands and became fascinated with the mechanical aspects of different firearms. Tommy Chen, the range master, watched this transformation with growing amazement. The silent woman, who had puzzled him for months, had gradually become the center of an informal community of veterans who clearly respected and cared for each other. He often observed their sessions from a distance, struck by the easy camaraderie and mutual support that characterized their interactions. One evening in November, about 2 months after the anniversary challenge, Sarah was shooting alone when she heard familiar footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find Walsh carrying a folder and wearing an expression that suggested he had something important to discuss. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, settling into the chair beside her shooting station. "Mind if we talk for a few minutes?" Sarah engaged the safety on her rifle and turned to face him fully. Over the past few weeks, their conversations had become more balanced as her ability to speak returned. She still preferred to listen, but she now contributed thoughts and observations with increasing frequency. "What's on your mind, Master Sergeant?" she asked, the military courtesy coming naturally despite their civilian setting. Walsh opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "I've been working on something for the past month, and I wanted to run it by you before taking it any further." Sarah looked at the papers curiously. The letterhead indicated they were from the Department of Veterans Affairs, but she couldn't make out the specific content from her angle. "Do you remember when I mentioned that I had recommended you for a Purple Heart after your injury?" Walsh asked. "The recommendation that got buried because your wounds weren't considered visible at the time?" Sarah nodded, remembering their conversation from months earlier. Well, there have been some changes in how the VA handles traumatic brain injuries and psychological wounds sustained in combat, Walsh continued. They're now recognizing these injuries as legitimate Purple Heart qualifications, and they're reviewing cases that were previously denied or overlooked. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized what Walsh was suggesting. I've been working with a veterans advocate to resubmit your case, Walsh explained. I've gathered statements from your former commanding officers, medical documentation, from your treatment after the explosion, and testimonials from people who can speak to your character and service record. Sarah stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The Purple Heart had always seemed like something that belonged to other soldiers, those who had sustained visible wounds that everyone could understand and recognize. She had never imagined that her invisible injuries might qualify for such recognition. Why? She asked quietly. Why go to all this trouble? Walsh looked at her with the serious expression she had come to associate with his most important conversations. Because you earned it, Sergeant. Because you were wounded in service to your country, and that sacrifice deserves to be acknowledged. And because I think you need to hear officially what those of us who know you have been saying all along. You're a warrior who was injured in the line of duty, not someone who simply couldn't handle the stress. Sarah felt tears beginning to form as the full impact of his words sank in. For 3 years she had struggled with guilt and self-doubt, wondering if her inability to speak was a sign of weakness or failure. The possibility that her injuries might be officially recognized as legitimate wounds sustained in combat felt like a validation she hadn't dared to hope for. What do I need to do? She asked. Walsh smiled at her direct soldier-like response. There are some forms you'll need to sign, and you might need to undergo a psychological evaluation by a VA psychiatrist, but most of the heavy lifting is already done. The advocate thinks we have a strong case. Over the next hour, Walsh walked Sarah through the paperwork, explaining each document and what it represented. There were medical records from her initial treatment after the explosion, statements from soldiers who had been in the convoy with her, and detailed accounts of her exemplary service record prior to the incident. As Sarah read through the materials, she was struck by how different her story sounded when told from an official, objective perspective. The documents portrayed her not as a victim who had broken under pressure, but as a skilled communications specialist who had sustained combat injuries while serving her country in a dangerous environment. There's something else, Walsh said, as they finished reviewing the paperwork. The advocate thinks your case could help other soldiers who are dealing with similar issues. If you're willing, they'd like to use your story as an example of how psychological wounds and TBI can affect veterans long after they return home. Sarah considered this request carefully. The idea of her private struggle becoming a public example was daunting, but she thought about other soldiers who might be suffering in silence, believing that their invisible wounds didn't qualify for recognition or support. Would it help other people, she asked. Potentially, yes, Walsh replied. There are probably hundreds of veterans dealing with similar issues who don't know that help is available or that their injuries are considered legitimate. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined speaking to anyone about her experiences, let alone allowing her story to be used as an example for other veterans. But the community she had found, the progress she had made, and the sense of purpose that Walsh's proposal offered made the decision clearer than she had expected. Okay, she said finally. If it helps other soldiers, then okay. Walsh's smile was one of genuine pride and respect. I think your grandfather would be proud of the soldier you become, Sergeant. Not just the one you were before the explosion, but the one you are now. Someone who's fought through incredible challenges and come out stronger on the other side. As they packed up their equipment that evening, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that first Tuesday when Walsh had whispered, "Outstanding grouping, Sergeant," from across the range. The silent woman who had hidden behind her solitude and her rifle had evolved into someone who could speak for herself and for others who shared her experiences. 3 months later, Sarah received official notification that her Purple Heart had been approved. The ceremony was small, held at the local VFW post with her support group family in attendance. As the medal was pinned to her dress uniform, Sarah spoke clearly and confidently for the first time since her injury, thanking the people who had helped her find her voice and her way back to herself. Walsh, wearing his own dress uniform for the occasion, stood at attention as Sarah delivered her brief acceptance speech. When she finished, he approached and offered a crisp military salute, one soldier acknowledging another's service and sacrifice. "Welcome back, Sergeant Martinez," he said formally, then added with a warm smile, "though you were never really gone." Sarah returned his salute with the precision and pride of the soldier she had always been, finally able to speak the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. "Thank you for helping me remember who I am." The shooting range still remained an important part of Sarah's life, but it was no longer a place of solitary healing. It had become a gathering spot for her chosen family of veterans, a place where they practiced their skills, shared their stories, and supported each other through the ongoing journey of life after service. And sometimes, when new veterans visited the range looking lost and alone, they would hear a familiar whisper across the lanes. "Outstanding grouping, soldier." An invitation to join a community that understood both the cost of service and the possibility of healing.